John Duns, commonly called Duns Scotus, is generally considered to be one of the three most important philosopher-theologians of the High Middle Ages. Scotus has had considerable influence on both Catholic and secular thought. The doctrines for which he is best known are the univocity of being, that existence is the most abstract concept we have, applicable to everything that exists, the formal distinction, a way of distinguishing between different aspects of the same thing, and the idea of haecceity, the property supposed to be in each individual thing that makes it an individual. Scotus also developed a complex argument for the existence of God, and argued for the Immaculate Conception of Mary. Duns Scotus was given the scholastic accolade Doctus of The for his penetrating and subtle manner of thought. He was beatified by Pope John Paul II in 1993. Life. Little is known of Duns Scotus apart from his work. His date of birth is thought to have been between the 23rd of December 1265 and the 17th of March 1266. Born into a leading family of the region, the site of his birth, in front of the Pavilion Lodge, near the North Lodge of Duns Castle, is now marked by a cairn which was erected in 1966 by the Franciscan friars of the United Kingdom to mark the 700th anniversary of his birth. Duns Scotus received the religious habit of the Friars Minor at Dumfries, where his uncle, Elias Duns, was guardian. Duns Scotus's age is based on the first certain date for his life, that of his ordination to the priesthood at St Andrews, Northampton, England on the 17th of March 1291. The minimum canonical age for receiving holy orders is 25, and it is generally assumed that he would have been ordained as soon as it was permitted, that his contemporaries called him Johannes Duns, after the medieval practice of calling people by the Christian name followed by the place of origin, suggests that he came from Duns, in Berwickshire, Scotland. According to tradition, Duns Scotus was educated at a Franciscan studium, a house behind St Ebbe's Church, Oxford, in a triangular area enclosed by Pennyfarthing Street and running from St Aldgates to the castle, the bailey and the old wall, where the Friars Minor had moved when the University of Paris was dispersed in 1229–30. At the time there would have been about 270 persons living there, of whom about 80 would have been friars. Duns Scotus appears to have been in Oxford by 1300, as he is listed among a group of friars for whom the provincial superior of the English ecclesiastical province requested faculties from the Bishop of Lincoln for the hearing of confessions. He took part in a disputation under the Regent Master, Philip of Bridlington. He began lecturing on Peter Lombard's sentences at the prestigious University of Paris towards the end of 1302. Later in that academic year, however, he was expelled from the University of Paris for siding with Pope Boniface VIII in his feud with King Philip IV of France over the taxation of church property. Duns Scotus was back in Paris before the end of 1304, probably returning in May. He continued lecturing there until, for reasons that are still mysterious, he was dispatched to the Franciscan studium at Cologne, probably in October 1307. According to the 15th-century writer William Vory Long, his departure was sudden and unexpected. He was relaxing at talking with students in the Prato Clericorum Aprio Clerks, an open area of the Rive Gauche used by scholars for recreation. When orders arrived from the Franciscan Minister-General, Scotus left immediately, taking few or no personal belongings. Duns Scotus died unexpectedly in Cologne in November 1308. The date of his death is traditionally given as the 8th of November. He is buried in the Church of the Friars Minor there. His sarcophagus bears the Latin inscription. The story about Duns Scotus being buried alive in the absence of his servant who alone knew of his susceptibility to coma is probably a myth. It was reported by Francis Bacon in his Historia Vitae Mortis. The colophon of Codex 66 of Merton College, Oxford, says that Scotus was also at Cambridge, but we do not know for certain if this is true, or if it was, when he was there. Work. Scotus's great work is his commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard, which contains nearly all the philosophical views and arguments for which he is well known, including the univocity of being, the formal distinction, less than numerical unity, individual nature or thisness, his critique of illuminationism and his renowned argument for the existence of God. His commentary exists in several versions. The standard version is the Ordinatio, a revised version of lectures he gave as a bachelor at Oxford. The initial revision was probably begun in the summer of 1300. See the remarks in the prologue. Question 2. Alluding to the Battle of Wadi al-Khazandar in 1299, news of which probably reached Oxford in the summer of 1300. It was still incomplete when Scotus left for Paris in 1302. The original lectures were also transcribed and recently published as the Lectura. The two other versions of the work are Scotus's notes for the Oxford Lectures, recently published as the Lectura, the first book of which was probably written in Oxford in the late 1290s, and the Reportatio Parisiensis, consisting of transcriptions of the lectures on the sentences given by Scotus when he was in Paris. A reportatio is a student report, a transcription of the original lecture of a master. A version that has been checked by the master himself is known as a reportatio examinata. By the time of Scotus, these commentaries on the sentences were no longer literal commentaries. Instead, Peter Lombard's original text was used as a starting point for highly original discussions on topics of theological or philosophical interest. For example, Book 2 Distinction 2 about the location of angels is a starting point for a complex discussion about continuous motion, and whether the same thing can be in two different places at the same time. In the same book, Distinction 3, he uses the question of how angels can be different from one another, given that they have no material bodies, to investigate the difficult question of individuation in general. Scotus wrote purely philosophical and logical works at an early stage of his career, consisting of commentaries on Aristotle's Organon. These are the questions on Porphyry's Isagoge and Aristotle's categories, Perihermeneias, and the Sophisticis Elenchis, probably dating to around 1295. His commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics was probably written in stages, the first version having started around 1297, with significant additions and amendments possibly after the completion of the main body of the Ordinatio. His expositio on the Metaphysics was lost for centuries but was recently rediscovered and edited by Giorgio Pini. In addition, there are 46 short disputations called Collations, probably dating from 1300 to 1305, a work in natural theology, and his Questions Quodlibetales, probably dating to Advent 1306, Lent 1307. A number of works once believed to have been written by Scotus are now known to have been misattributed. There were already concerns about this within 2 centuries of his death, when the 16th-century logician Jacobus Navarrus noted inconsistencies between these texts and his commentary on the sentences, leading him to doubt whether he had written any logical works at all. The questions on the prior analytics were also discovered to be mistakenly attributed. In 1922, Grabman showed that the logical work De Modis Significandi was actually by Thomas of Erfurt, a 14th-century logician of the Modist school. Thus the claim that Martin Heidegger ago wrote his habilitation schrift on Scotus is only half true, as the second part is actually based on the work by Erfurt. Metaphysics Realism. Scotus is generally considered to be a realist in that he treated universals as real. He attacks a position close to that later defended by Occam, arguing that things have a common nature, for example the humanity common to Socrates, Plato, and Plutarch. Univocity of being. He followed Aristotle in asserting that the subject matter of metaphysics is being qua being. Being in general, as a univocal notion, was for him the first object of the intellect. Metaphysics includes the study of the transcendentals, so called because they transcend the division of being into finite and infinite and the further division of finite being into the 10 Aristotelian categories. Being itself is a transcendental, and so are the attributes of being, one, true, and good, which are coextensive with being, but which each add something to it. The doctrine of the univocity of being implies the denial of any real distinction between essence and existence. Aquinas had argued that in all finite being, the essence of a thing is distinct from its existence. Scotus rejected the distinction. Scotus argued that we cannot conceive of what it is to be something without conceiving it as existing. We should not make any distinction between whether a thing exists and what it is, for we never know whether something exists, unless we have some concept of what we know to exist. Individuation. Scotus elaborates a distinct view on hylomorphism, with three important strong theses that differentiate him. He held, 1. That there exists matter that has no form whatsoever, or prime matter, as the stuff underlying all change, against Aquinas. 2. That not all created substances are composites of form and matter, that is, that purely spiritual substances do exist. And 3. That one and the same substance can have more than one substantial form. For instance, humans have at least two substantial forms, the soul and the form of the body. He argued for an original principle of individuation, the haecceity, as the ultimate unity of a unique individual, as opposed to the common nature feature existing in any number of individuals. For Scotus, the axiom stating that only the individual exists is a dominating principle of the understanding of reality. For the apprehension of individuals, an intuitive cognition is required, which gives us the present existence of the non-existence of an individual, as opposed to abstract cognition. Thus the human soul, in its separated state from the body, will be capable of knowing the spiritual intuitively. Formal distinction. Like other realist philosophers of the period, Scotus recognized the need for an intermediate distinction that was not merely conceptual, but not fully real or mind-dependent either. Scotus argued for a formal distinction, which holds between entities which are inseparable and indistinct in reality, but whose definitions are not identical. For example, the personal properties of the Trinity are formally distinct from the divine essence. Similarly, the distinction between the thisness or haecceity of a thing is intermediate between a real and a conceptual distinction. There is also a formal distinction between the divine attributes and the powers of the soul. Theology Voluntarism. Scotus was an Augustinian theologian. He is usually associated with theological voluntarism, the tendency to emphasize God's will and human freedom in all philosophical issues. The main difference between Aquinas' rational theology and that of Scotus's is that Scotus believed certain predicates may be applied univocally, with exactly the same meaning, to God and creatures, whereas Aquinas insisted that this is impossible, and that only analogical predication can be employed, in which a word as applied to God has a meaning different from, although related to, the meaning of that same word as applied to creatures. Duns struggled throughout his works in demonstrating his univocity theory against Aquinas' analogy doctrine. Metaphysical argument for the existence of God. Duns Scotus argued that it is better to construct a metaphysical argument for the existence of God, rather than the more common physical argument from motion favored by Aquinas, following Aristotle. Though the version in De Primo Principio is the most complete and final version, the ordinatio proof is usually offered. However, the De Primo version is fascinating and worth looking into for a wider understanding of the argument as well as Scotus's metaphysical underpinnings, for his argument for God's existence. But we shall base this section of the article on the ordinatio version. Let us briefly outline Scotus's argument. He begins his proof by explaining that there are two angles we must take in arguing for the existence of an actually infinite being. First, we must approach from the view of the relative properties of God. Second, from the absolute properties of God. Relative properties are those which are predicable of God in relation to creation. Absolute properties are those which belong to God whether or not He chose to create. Under the first heading of relative properties, Scotus argues for a triple primacy of efficiency, finality and preeminence. Further, he shows that one primacy implies the others, and finally there can only be one nature that is the first efficient cause, ultimate end, and the most perfect nature. Further, the subtle doctor discusses the absolute properties of God. The first being is intellectual and volitional, and the intellect and will are identical with the essence of this supreme nature. The first being is also infinite being. While discussing the infinity of God, Scotus resurrects Anselm's than which argument and responds to the criticism that Anselm makes an illicit leap from concept to reality. Finally, he gives a definite answer of yeses to the question of whether there exists an actually infinite being. The very next question of the ordinatio deals with the unicity of the nature thus proved to exist. However, the De Primo Principio version concludes with this argument. Since the argument is very long and has many parts, we shall content ourselves in this article with stating the premises for the existence of the first efficient cause, assuming that the reader will follow the citations to read the rest of the argument. The proof for the conclusion that some efficient cause is simply first such that neither can it be an effect nor can it, by virtue of something other than itself, cause an effect. Ordinatio I 2.43 runs something like this. Something A is produced. It is produced either by itself, nothing, or another. Not by nothing, for nothing causes nothing. Not by itself, for an effect never causes itself. Therefore, by another, call it B. We return to 2. B is produced either by itself, nothing, or another. The ascending series will either continue infinitely or we finally reach something which has nothing prior to it. An infinite ascending series is impossible. Therefore, a simply first efficient cause exists. Scotus acknowledges two objections and deals with them accordingly. First is that he begs the question in assuming a first in the series. Here he argues that while many admit an infinite regress in an accidentally ordered series of causes, no philosopher admits infinite regress in an essentially ordered series. Scotus explains the differences between the two and offers proofs for the conclusion that an infinity of essentially ordered causes in a series is impossible. Second, it is objected that his proof is not really a demonstration since it begins with the contingent premise that something is produced is contingent and not necessary. Therefore, the proof proceeds from a contingent and not a necessary premise. Scotus says that while that is true, it is utterly manifest that things are produced or affected. But in order to respond, Scotus makes the modal move and reworks the argument. Now he argues from the possibility of production. It is possible that something can be produced is a necessary proposition, for there he is able to conclude that it is possible that the first efficient cause exists, and if it is possible that it exists, then it does exist. He assures us that the last claim will be proved later in the argument. In the lecture of proof, Scotus argues the following way. Although beings different from God are actually contingent with respect to the factual existence, nevertheless, they are not with respect to their possible existence. Hence, those entities which are called contingent with respect to the factual existence are necessarily with respect to their possible existence. For instance, although there exists a man is contingent, nevertheless, it is possible that he exists is necessary, because his existence does not include any contradiction. Therefore, something different from God is possible is necessary, because being is divided into the contingent and the necessary. Just as necessity belongs to a necessary being in virtue of its condition or its quiddity, so possibility belongs to a possible being in virtue of its quiddity. If the first argument is alternatively qualified with the notion of ontological possibility, then we have necessary propositions as follows. It is possible that there is something different from God. It is not of itself, nor from nothing. Therefore, it is possible that it is from something else. Either it is possible that the other agent acts by virtue of itself, and not by virtue of something else, not being from something else, or it is not possible. If so, then it is possible that there is a first agent, and if it possible that it exists, then it exists, just as we have proved before. If not, and if there is no infinite regress, then the argument at once comes to a standstill. More can and should be said about this fascinating argument, but we leave it to the reader to search out more of the argument. See especially http://www.logicmuseum.com wiki authors Duns Scotus or Ordinatio _un D2Q2b. Illuminationism. Scotus argued against the version of Illuminationism that had been defended earlier in the century by Henry of Ghent. In his Ordinatio, he argued against the skeptical consequences that Henry claimed would follow from abandoning divine illumination. Scotus argued that if our thinking were fallible in the way Henry had believed, such illumination could not, even in principle, ensure certain and pure knowledge. Quote, when one of those that come together is incompatible with certainty, then certainty cannot be achieved. For just as from one premise that is necessarily and one that is contingent nothing follows but a contingent conclusion, so from something certain and something uncertain coming together in some cognition, no cognition that is certain follows. Immaculate Conception. Perhaps the most influential point of Duns Scotus's theology was his defense of the Immaculate Conception of Mary. At the time, there was a great deal of argument about the subject. The general opinion was that it was appropriately deferential to the Mother of God, but it could not be seen how to resolve the problem that only with Christ's death would the stain of original sin be removed. The great philosophers and theologians of the West were divided on the subject. The feast day had existed in the East since the 7th century and had been introduced in several dioceses in the West as well, even though the philosophical basis was lacking. Citing Anselm of Canterbury's principle, potuit dicit ergo facit, Duns Scotus devised the following argument. Mary was in need of redemption like all other human beings, but through the merits of Jesus' crucifixion, given in advance, she was conceived without the stain of original sin. God could have brought it about that she was never in original sin. She was in sin only for an instant. She was in sin for a period of time, being purged at the last instant. Whichever of these options was most excellent should probably be attributed to Mary. This apparently careful statement provoked a storm of opposition at Paris, and suggested the line, "Fired France for Mary without spot," in the famous poem, Duns Scotus' Oxford, by Gerard Manley Hopkins. Scotus's argument appears in Pope Pius IX's circa 1854 declaration of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. At the first moment of her conception, Mary was preserved free from the stain of original sin, in view of the merits of Jesus Christ. Scotus's position was hailed as a correct expression of the faith of the apostles. Another of Scotus's positions also gained official approval of the Roman Catholic Church. His doctrine on the universal primacy of Christ became the underlying rationale for the Feast of Christ the King instituted in 1925. During his pontificate, Pope John XXIII recommended the reading of Duns Scotus's theology to modern theology students. Veneration, long honored as a blessed by the Order of Friars Minor, as well as in the archdioceses of Edinburgh and Cologne. In the 19th century, the process was started seeking his recognition as such by the Holy See, on the basis of a cultus a memorabilis, i.e., one of ancient standing. He was declared venerable by Pope John Paul II in 1991, who officially recognized his liturgical cult, effectively beatifying him on the 20th of March 1993.